Hey everyone, welcome to another tutorial from webcrunch.com. I am Andy, and this guide is about enums in Ruby on Rails. We're going to be running Ruby on Rails 7.2 at this time. That's the latest and greatest as I'm recording this, but the general idea of this guide is to give you basically an overview of what enums are. And if you're first coming to Rails or first coming to this concept, it's kind of new and kind of foreign. And I remember when I first saw it, I was kind of like, what is all this stuff? And that's kind of some of the backlash against the Ruby on Rails framework. There's a lot of magic baked into it, and this is kind of one of those things. And to be honest, I love it, but some people don't. So they want to have like full control. And in this case, there's a lot of automation. So an enum is essentially a way to set some sort of state in some column in your database. But from that, if you pass it in a certain model, like in the docs here, like conversation, for instance, you could pass a status column. This is the way it's commonly used. You can do it for anything that has some sort of state that changes, like billing states or, I don't know, subscription states, stuff like that. But then you get past these other attributes, which are things you name, like different states you expect a resource to be in. So in this case, a conversation could be active or archived. And then with that, it comes bundled with all these cool helper methods that allow you to just perform things on the fly without doing any traditional like Rails dot update attribute kind of method calls. So that's the beauty of it. It also comes with some default scopes. So I just wanted to get into how we could run with it with a post model type. I'm going to do a very simple plain Jane app to run with it. So I'll do Rails new enum guide. I have one already called demo, so I'll just do guide. And this will just create a basic vanilla Ruby on Rails 7.02 app. Nothing crazy for CSS or JavaScript. It's just all the defaults. And then we'll say cd into enum guide. And all I want to do is just do a scaffold. So Rails generate scaffold post. We'll have a title. We'll have a content area, which is going to be a text. I might use Markdown or something for that. And then a status table. And we're going to pass this as an integer. And if you're new to the framework, if you do this generation and don't pass anything, it's going to be a string by default. But you can also just pass string there just to, for closure's sake. And then remember to put integer for the status column. That's going to be important coming up. Okay, so it goes and creates all of the stuff we need, and there's really not a lot we have to do to get this up and running. I just want to show you by example because sometimes the documentation is a little overwhelming, but I don't even really need to see the server, the app fired up if you really don't want to. One convention I like to do when I do set these though is have a default status. And you can set this in the model, but oftentimes it's good practice to do it in the database just because it's kind of a locking mechanism, so to speak. Someone can't go change the model later and really break things. So in this case, I'll have a default set to 0. And in programming, typically integers start at 0. So in an array, for instance, it starts at 0, goes to 1, 2, 3, and so on. So there's that kind of 0 start concept. So before you run that migration on a typical Rails install like this, you just want to pass that default value. We'll do db migrate. Run that. It creates post table. Very simple, normal stuff here. So I'll just do bin dev to show you. Let's see. We don't have it. I'll just do Rails server. And there's our, opening thing. If we go to posts, we should see new posts. Nothing special here. Status is going to be an integer. It's going to have a number field. You wouldn't have that in your view normally. You could take that out, but I'm not going to even worry about the view right now. I just want to show you the app boots up and has that resource scaffolded. So when you run a scaffold, it's going to generate all the stuff you need to create that controller logic, the model logic, the view, etc. I don't know if you're new to the framework, but that's the general idea of a scaffold. It saves a lot of time, but it does come with some costs with generating a lot of files, as you saw. Okay, so the main focus here is to focus on the post model type. And when you set an enum value, you need to pass an enum declaration like so, and then pass the actual column on your database that you're referring to. So in our case, it's going to be status. And then alongside the status, you would pass essentially the values of states you're going to expect to see. So in our case, since it's a post, I'm thinking of a blog. You would often pass like published maybe, and draft, and then maybe archived. I don't know if you have old posts you don't want live anymore. Be careful using things like private. That is a reserved term in the Ruby and Rails space, so you want to use something different in that case. That will come up to bite you if you do use that, so don't consider that one. I think I've used before is like hidden or something like that, but then just named it private in the views. So with this, the cool thing here is we get a lot of stuff for free. So when you declare this, I'll go and just run the console real quick, change the profile. Okay, so Rails console post, we've got, I'll just do connection just so it does its thing. So post, there's our actual post schema that's got the ID that comes by default with ActiveRecord, title, content, status is integer, and then the timestamps we get for free too. So a neat thing is you could just say like a p equals post, and then p dot published will actually give you a default scope based on what we've already set here in this array. And that's pretty cool because you don't have to go define that scope yourself in this model. It's just set up by passing something here. So if you ever define your own scope, you know that comes with some setup. You write like scope, and then there's like a lambda function with all that stuff inside. Then you do like a where clause and just have stuff that's chainable if you've understood scopes. I have another video about scopes if you want to go check that out. I don't know that I'll link to it here, but check out my channel. And with that, you get these free helper methods, free scopes. So the drafts, and for instance, is going to just go and do this select where clause. So essentially behind the scenes, it's going post.where status, and you could pass, in this case, draft, and it'll find it all the same. You could also pass 1 here, and it'll do the same here. Because if you look at this array, if you think of in terms of an array in programming, it always starts at 0. So 0 is actually going to map to this. And that's why we set in the schema, it's actually a integer. So there, you're setting the default to a 0 integer instead of like the actual string. Now you could do strings, but that leads to lower performance and speed with the lookups. So it's good to use the integer in this case, especially if there's a lot of statuses. So it would map, in this case, we could just do, I'll just do a comment. So published, just to make it obvious, will be 0, draft is going to be 1, and then archived is going to be 2, and so on and so forth. Now the kicker with passing an array value here is that if you ever wanted to change something and you added another state in here, like I don't even know, reserved, I don't know, maybe in review, that comes with some costs. Because suddenly your state changes based on the array values. So if you think again, this is 0, this is 1, now suddenly this one's 2 and this one's 3. So that comes with some like double-edged swords, and you run into some issues where the data is correct, but the signifier or status in the enum is incorrect. So my recommendation is always to add them at the end, and if you need to remove them, that's kind of also trouble. So especially if there's one like up here, that gets tricky very, very fast. So often what I'll do instead of this array value, and I'll just do this real quick, I'll write it again, say status, and I'll actually pass a hash instead. So what's cool about that is it allows you to pass the integer to it and assign it manually. So published, in our case, we'll set that to the default, which is 0. Draft will be 1. Archived 2, and so on. So anything you want to add there more, you get that by default. And that's pretty powerful because you can always go in and change these. If you want something in a different order, you can have it there, but still pass the integer you need. So maybe I want this one to be in this spot in the hash for whatever reason, but I could still denote it as 1 instead of 2 here so that the ordering doesn't get quite messed up there. Okay. So that's like the basics of establishing and setting up those enums. With this comes some cool perks, and I'll just do it in this file just to show you. So like if you were to query for this post, you suddenly get this type of call you can pass is that scope we talked about. So a scope where it does like a post where status published. Cool. And then you also get the post dot published with a bang, and that essentially sets a status. So you've got a getter and setter kind of concept here. So that says I'm going to set the status will equal to published in this case. And then you get another one that's post.published with the question mark, and that's a Boolean operation. So you could say, well, is this a true or false? And I could check the status essentially behind the scenes, and if it is published, we'll get a true value back. If not, it'll get false. And then finally, you can also just do post.status to get the current status. So that would essentially mean, you know, is it published? If so, it would output published, and so on and so forth. Now, you get all of these for everything you pass up here. So consider that the same in our case for draft. So just revert these to that, and then this will be draft. And then finally, you could get the same with archive. Pretty powerful in my opinion. So now we get that built in just by this one liner and a few keys and values, and I think that's super cool. It allows you to do things really fast in the controllers and the views, etc., where you need to, you know, check certain states. If something's in a certain state, maybe you show a different button, maybe you show different content, etc. This comes in handy for like billing, like subscription statuses or resource statuses like a post or article, something like that. Okay, additionally, with these scopes, we can actually get the inversion of it too. So we get this for, you know, for free as well. So if you were to do post.publish, I don't know why I'm commenting this, I'll just do it now. Post.publish, we get, you know, the published ones back. So all published posts. If you don't want the published ones, you can get all not published. So that would refer to anything that's drafted or archived in this case. That kind of combines those. And then you could go down the chain. So that applies to all of these. So you could say post.draft, post.notdraft, post.archived, and post.notArchived. Pretty sweet. So again, all drafts, all non-drafts, all archived, all non-archived. Now, say you want to turn off this scoping mechanism. Maybe you want to make your own scopes that vary slightly. Maybe there's dates involved and suddenly it becomes more complex. You can also pass another property here. It just says scopes false, and it turns that bit off. So all you'll have left are these actual status-based helper methods, and your models, you don't have to worry about the scopes. That's rare for me that I need to do that, but that's something you can do. You can also pass something called prefix and suffix. Let's do suffix first. So if you just set suffix to true, you essentially you would add the status column naming convention to the end of the helper method. So in all these cases, it would revert to status at the end. That's the suffix side of it. So we'll say suffix. Now, if you want to do a prefix, you could do the same. So prefix, I think these are going to be rare, but maybe you have a big app and you want to call it something special. So I don't know what I'd call this, like user. So in that case, you would get prefix users. We'll just do user. I think it's users. Okay. So that means it's going to come before it. So you'd say post.users published, something to that effect. And the same with draft, etc. So you could do stuff like that. I find that like not as intuitive, because then you suddenly have this kind of weird naming convention, and it's hard to kind of quickly assess what is actually coming back with that regard. But that's just something you can do. Doesn't mean you need to. The last thing I'm wanting to mention, that you remember in our migration file, we actually had the default set here, and that's probably the best bet to do. But if you don't want to, for some reason, set that in the data layer. You can actually set it on the model, so you could just default to maybe published in this case, and that just allows you to do that. So that means you're going to pass to the enum column that published is going to be our default, basically posting. So that is a quick overview of enums. Hopefully that was helpful. I know we're not using it in real time, like building something real, but I think it's self-explanatory in this case that on a post model, you might want to do stuff and scope it by published. And instead of like establishing all those scopes on your model yourself, you can get it built in if you use a status enum, assuming you need those. So very powerful stuff. Really recommend checking out the docs I've got over here. So we've got a lot more to, edge cases you could add, specific ways to query for different statuses. If you need something more unique in a given state, different ways of writing those enum statuses that I talked about, and so on and so forth. But I think I covered everything that was there. So if you have any questions or feedback, let me know. Really happy to keep going on this, and excited for the next one. All right, see you guys.